I remember the weight of my own thoughts before they became something else entirely. The memory feels distant now, like trying to recall a dream through layers of static and communion hymns that never cease their droning in the depths of my skull. I was once a man named Kellyan Thros, a manufactorum supervisor on the forge world of Metallica Prime, though that designation feels as foreign to me now as speaking in the tongue of Xenos. The flesh I inhabited then was weak, yes, but it was mine, and with it came the burden and blessing of choice, of doubt, of the small rebellions that make a soul human. The transformation began not with the bite of surgical blades or the kiss of augmetic implants, but with a single clerical error buried in the administratum's endless data stacks. A misplaced digit in my identification number, a transcription mistake made by some bleary-eyed scribe in a hab block 1,000 kilometers away, working through his 14th consecutive shift under the sickly glow of phosphor lamps. Such small things determine the fate of men in the Imperium, and I have come to understand that this is not accident but design, the machine god's way of testing the faithful and culling the weak. The error reclassified me from Manufactorum Supervisor Grade 7 to Penal Servitor candidate, and once the gears of Imperial bureaucracy began turning, no amount of protest could stop them. The summons arrived during the pre-dawn shift change, delivered by a servo skull whose optical lenses regarded me with the cold indifference of the machine. The parchment bore the seal of the Adeptus Mechanicus, red wax impressed with the twin-headed aquila, and as I broke it open, the document's contents seemed to burn themselves into my retinas. By order of Magos Dominus Vex Korthak, citizen unit designated Kellyan Thros, is hereby conscripted for blessed conversion to Servitor class for the greater glory of the Omnissiah. The words were framed in high Gothic calligraphy, each letter precise as a lasbium, beautiful and terrible in their finality. I tried to run, of course. What man wouldn't? The Manufactorum complex sprawled across 12 square kilometers of polluted ferrocrete and twisted metal, a labyrinth of conveyor systems, fusion cores, and chemical processing plants that stretched toward the ash-gray sky like the ribs of some mechanical leviathan. I knew its passages better than any man alive, had walked its corridors for 15 years, supervising the production of power cells and ammunition for the Emperor's endless wars. But knowledge meant nothing when set against the will of the machine god. The servo skulls found me in the underhive maintenance shafts, their red targeting lasers painting my sweat-soaked skin as I cowered behind rusted pipes that wept condensation like tears. The Skitari who dragged me from my hiding place moved with the fluid precision of their augmetic limbs, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks that gave them the appearance of insectoid horrors. One of them, a sergeant by the brass scarification across his visible jaw, spoke in binary cant to his squad mates, the rapid clicks and whistles sounding like nothing human. They bound my hands with neural shackles that sent bolts of agony up my arms whenever I struggled, and as we emerged into the perpetual twilight of the Manufactorum's main thoroughfare, I saw other conscripts being herded toward the transport crawlers, men and women I had worked alongside for years, their faces blank with shock and terror, stumbling forward under the watchful gaze of hovering servo skulls. The journey to the conversion facilities lasted 3 days aboard a maglev transport that reeked of fear sweat and recycled air. We were packed into cargo containers normally used for shipping weapons components, 40 souls to a cell barely large enough for 20. The walls sweated condensation that tasted of rust and despair when it dripped into our mouths, and the only illumination came from a single flickering lumen strip that cast our faces in sickly yellow shadows. The transport's motion sent vibrations through the floor that seemed to burrow into our bones, a constant reminder that we were being carried farther and farther from everything we had ever known. A woman named Jessica sat beside me during that interminable journey, a quality assessor from the ammunition foundries whose crime had been questioning the purity standards of bolt shells destined for an Astartes chapter. She spoke in whispers about her daughter, a 14-year-old girl who would now become a ward of the administratum, processed through their orphan mills, and eventually assigned to whatever role the Imperium deemed suitable. She plays the vocalator, Jessica told me, her voice cracking like old parchment. "Makes the most beautiful hymns you ever heard. The instructors said she might qualify for the Schola Cantorum if she kept practicing." Her fingers worked constantly at a small piece of metal she had torn from the wall, shaping it into something that might have been a flower, might have been a shrine to the Emperor, might have been nothing at all but the desperate need to create something before her hands were taken from her forever. The man across from us never spoke, just stared at the ceiling with eyes that had already gone dead. His work coveralls bore the insignia of a plasma technician, and I could see the faint scars of old burns along his forearms where containment failures had branded him. When the transport shuddered to a halt for refueling, and we heard the distant sound of hymnal being broadcast from external voxcasters, he began to weep soundlessly, tears carving tracks through the grime on his cheeks. The servo skull that monitored our cell registered his emotional distress with a soft chime and noted it on whatever data slate governed our fates. The facility appeared through the narrow viewing slits, like a vision from the Emperor's darkest dreams. Towering spires of black adamantine rose from the surface of an unnamed moon, their surfaces crawling with the tracked forms of maintenance servitors and the skeletal shapes of construction mechadendrites. The architecture spoke of the Omnissiah's grand design, all geometric perfection and brutal functionality, devoid of the small human touches that make a place feel like home. Landing platforms jutted from the main complex like metallic tongues, and as our transport settled onto one with a grinding of maglev coils, I could see other vessels discharging their human cargo. Thousands of conscripts, all destined for the blessed conversion that would strip away their weakness and transform them into perfect servants of the machine god. The air outside tasted of ozone and sacred oils, thick with the scent of industrial processes beyond my comprehension. Tech adepts moved between the landing platforms with the measured gait of those who have replaced doubt with certainty, their red robes rustling like the wings of carrion birds. Servo skulls circled overhead in precise patterns, their optical lenses recording everything for analysis and categorization. The sound of the facility's operation filled the air, a symphony of grinding gears, humming power cells, and the distant chanting of the tech priests who guided the sacred work within. We were sorted with the efficiency that only the Adeptus Mechanicus could achieve. Biometric scanners read our genetic codes and cross-referenced them with databases spanning centuries. Cogitator banks calculated our optimal conversion paths based on physical attributes, psychological profiles, and the current needs of the Imperium. Some were designated for combat servitors, their bodies to be rebuilt around weapon systems and targeting algorithms. Others would become heavy-lifting units, their spines reinforced with adamantine struts, and their muscles supplemented with hydraulic assist systems. A few, the lucky ones perhaps, were marked for basic maintenance work, simple alterations that would leave some fragment of their original selves intact. My classification came through in binary cant that the processing servitor translated into Gothic with mechanical precision, neural patterns suitable for advanced cogitator integration, recommended for data processing servitor conversion, grade 4 complexity rating. The words meant nothing to me then, but I have learned their significance in the months since. Grade 4 meant that enough of my original mind would be preserved to handle complex calculations while being sufficiently lobotomized to prevent independent thought. I would become a living computer, my consciousness compressed into a narrow band of function, while my body was rebuilt to serve the machine god's purposes. The holding cells where we awaited conversion were carved from the living rock of the moon, their walls bearing the tool marks of construction servitors who had labored without rest to prepare this place. Each cell contained 50 potential converts, and the air grew thick with the sounds of quiet desperation as men and women who had once been citizens of the Imperium came to terms with their fate. Some prayed to the Emperor, their voices rising in the familiar litanies they had learned in childhood. Others retreated into themselves, conserving whatever strength they could for the trials ahead. A few, the ones whose minds had already begun to crack under the pressure, spoke to invisible companions or recited fragments of poetry in languages I didn't recognize. I watched them all from my corner, trying to memorize their faces before the surgeons claimed them. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, attempting to preserve their humanity in my memory while my own was scheduled for systematic removal. But perhaps that was what separated us from the machines we were destined to become. This desperate need to witness, to remember, to honor what was about to be lost. The first selection came at what might have been dawn, though time had become meaningless in our windowless prison. Heavy boots echoed in the corridor beyond our cell, accompanied by the mechanical whirring of servo skulls conducting their grim inventory. A tech, adept, appeared at the bars, his augmetic eye casting a red beam across our huddled forms like a searchlight, seeking prey. You, and you, he intoned, his vox grill turning each word into a metallic rasp. His finger, more piston than flesh, pointed at 3 of our number, an elderly man, who had been weeping quietly for hours, a young woman whose hands wouldn't stop shaking, and a middle-aged laborer whose defiant glare had never wavered. They were led away without ceremony, their footsteps growing fainter until only the ambient hum of the ship's machinery remained. We never saw them again, though sometimes, in the depths of sleep, I thought I could hear them screaming. Whether this was memory, imagination, or the ship's acoustics carrying sounds from the surgical bays, I could never determine. Days blended into each other, marked only by the regular selections and the slow transformation of our temporary community. Those who remained began to change in ways that had nothing to do with surgical intervention. The elderly professor who had taught literature on some forgotten world began reciting increasingly fragmented verses, his once precise diction dissolving into mechanical repetitions. A former merchant started organizing invisible inventories, counting and cataloging items that existed only in his deteriorating mind. I found myself drawing closer to a woman named Vera, though I only learned her name during what turned out to be our final conversation. She had been a medicae on a frontier world, she told me, skilled in the ancient art of healing without augmentation. The irony of her situation, a healer about to be transformed into something that existed only to serve, seemed to weigh on her more heavily than the prospect of physical modification. "Do you think they remember?" she asked one night, her voice barely audible above the ship's constant mechanical breathing. "The ones who've already been converted. Do you think somewhere, buried beneath all that metal and programming, something of who they were still exists?" I considered her question, watching a servo skull drift past our cell on some unknown errand. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think that's what frightens me most, not the cutting or the implants, but the possibility that we'll still be conscious, trapped inside our own bodies, while something else controls our actions." She was quiet for a long time after that, and when she finally spoke again, her words carried a weight that suggested she had reached some internal resolution. "Then we have to make sure we remember everything now, while we still can. Every face, every voice, every moment of being human. Maybe it won't matter in the end, but maybe it will." The next morning, they came for her. As the weeks passed, our numbers dwindled, and I began to understand the cruel efficiency of the Mechanicus selection process. They weren't choosing randomly. They were studying us, categorizing our responses to stress, fear, and despair. Those who broke down completely were taken first, perhaps deemed suitable only for the most basic servitor functions. Those who maintained some semblance of resistance or independence were reserved for later, possibly for more complex roles that required retention of certain cognitive functions. I fell somewhere in the middle, neither completely broken nor defiantly resistant, but possessed of an analytical mind that I couldn't quite suppress even in our circumstances. I found myself documenting everything: the patterns of selection, the psychological profiles of those chosen, the gradual changes in the behavior of those who remained. It was a futile exercise, perhaps, but it gave me something to focus on besides the inevitable. One day, a new figure appeared outside our cell, not a tech adept this time, but what appeared to be a senior tech priest. His form so heavily augmented that determining his original biological components would have required archaeological excavation. Multiple mechanical arms extended from his torso, each ending in a different specialized tool, while his head had been replaced entirely by a complex sensor array that clicked and whirred as it examined us. "Subjects demonstrate acceptable psychological resilience parameters," he announced to his accompanying acolytes, his voice emerging from speakers embedded in his chest cavity. "Neural plasticity indices remain within conversion tolerances. Proceed with final preparation protocols." Final preparation. The words sent a chill through what remained of our Group 5 individuals who had somehow survived the gradual winnowing of our numbers. We were moved to a different section of the ship, individual cells that prevented further communication, but allowed us to observe the preparations being made for our transformation. The surgical bays were visible through armored glass windows, gleaming chambers filled with devices whose purposes I could only guess at. Robotic arms hung from ceiling tracks like sleeping serpents, their ends equipped with saws, drills, and implements I had no names for. Tanks of nutrient solutions bubbled quietly in the corners, their contents obscured by condensation that might have been steam or simply the breath of whatever floated within. I spent hours watching the servitors who maintained these facilities, trying to find some trace of the humans they had once been. Their movements were efficient but utterly without personality. They performed their tasks with mechanical precision, showing no awareness of the irony inherent in their situation. Were they content? Tormented? Simply absent? Their faces, what remained of them, offered no clues. On what I calculated to be my final night as a complete human being, I was visited by the same tech priest who had overseen our final selection. He stood outside my cell for several minutes, his sensor array focusing on me with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "You have been observing," he stated, not asking but confirming something he had already determined. "Recording, analyzing. These behaviors indicate preservation of higher cognitive functions despite psychological stress parameters." I saw no point in denying what was obvious. "Yes," I replied. "Designation: Servitor Scribe. Classification: Tertius. Function: data recording and analysis for sacred research protocols. Consciousness retention: 47%. Motor autonomy: 12%. Probability of successful conversion: 83.7%. He was telling me my fate with the casual precision of a weather report. I would retain nearly half of my awareness, enough to understand what had been done to me, but not enough to resist or change it. I would spend whatever remained of my existence as a living recording device, documenting information for masters who viewed me as nothing more than a particularly sophisticated tool. "Why tell me this?" I asked. His sensor array tilted slightly, a gesture that might have been curiosity in a being capable of such emotions. "Because the conversion process benefits from subject cooperation. Fear and resistance create neural instabilities that reduce operational efficiency. Acceptance facilitates optimal integration. So even my final conversation as a human was part of their process, designed to make my transformation smoother and more complete. The clinical efficiency of it was almost admirable in its thoroughness. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I did as Vera had suggested. I remembered everything I could. Every conversation, every face, every moment of genuine human connection I had experienced. I tried to imprint them so deeply in whatever would remain of my consciousness that perhaps, in the dark moments to come, I might still have access to some fragment of who I had been. The surgical team came for me at what my body told me was dawn. They were gentle, almost respectful, as they led me to the preparation chamber. Perhaps they had been human once themselves, though if any trace of that humanity remained, it was buried too deeply for me to detect. The last thing I saw as they placed me on the surgical table was my own reflection in the polished surface of a medical device, a frightened face staring back at me, still recognizably human, but already marked for transformation. I tried to memorize that image, to preserve some record of who I had been before the cutting began. Then the anesthesia took hold, and consciousness faded into a darkness that would be unlike any sleep I had ever known. I awakened to sensation without sight, consciousness returning in fragments like shattered glass slowly reassembling. There was no gentle emergence from sleep, no gradual awareness of my surroundings. Instead, awareness struck like a lightning bolt, immediate, overwhelming, and utterly alien. The first thing I noticed was the absence of pain. Not the blessed relief of medication, but something far more disturbing. The complete disconnection from physical sensation, as I had known it. Where once my body had been a constant companion of aches, warmth, the subtle pressure of clothing against skin, now there was only interface. Data streams flowed where nerves once carried sensation. Temperature readings replaced the feeling of warmth or cold. Pressure sensors provided numerical values where once I might have felt the weight of my own limbs. I existed now in a world of quantified experience, each sensation reduced to data points and measurements that my consciousness somehow interpreted as reality. My vision returned as optical sensors came online, but this too was transformed. The world appeared in overlays of information, structural analysis, material composition, threat assessment parameters scrolling across my visual field like a constant stream of technical documentation. When I attempted to focus on a simple wall, I saw not just its surface but density readings, composition analysis, stress point calculations. The overwhelming flood of data threatened to drown my consciousness in its mechanical precision. I tried to move, and servomotors whirred to life in response to neural impulses that no longer traveled through flesh and bone. My arm, or what had been my arm, raised into my field of vision, and I beheld for the first time what I had become. Where once had been flesh, now gleamed burnished metal and ceramic composites. Cables snaked along the limb like technological veins, pulsing with data transmissions rather than blood. Joints moved with mechanical precision, each motion accompanied by subtle hydraulic hisses and the whisper of well-oiled bearings. The sight should have horrified me, yet I found myself analyzing the craftsmanship with a detachment that was itself disturbing. The engineering was remarkable, elegant solutions to complex biomechanical problems, redundant systems, ensuring continued function even under adverse conditions. Part of my mind, a part that felt increasingly dominant, appreciated the technological achievement, even as some deeper, more human portion recoiled in silent horror. Memory files activated as my cognitive processes fully initialized, and I began to understand the scope of my transformation. The surgical logs were stored in accessible memory banks, technical documentation of procedures that had been performed on what the files clinically referred to as the subject. I could review each step of my conversion with perfect clarity, the removal of organs deemed redundant, the installation of life support systems, the careful integration of mechanical components with remaining biological tissues. My heart, I discovered, had been replaced with a more efficient mechanical pump. My lungs now served primarily as cooling systems for internal components, supplemented by atmospheric processes that could function in environments that would have killed my original biological form. Most disturbing of all, portions of my brain had been augmented with cogitator implants that enhanced processing speed and memory capacity, while simultaneously ensuring compliance with Mechanicus doctrine. The compliance protocols were subtle but pervasive. When I attempted to question the necessity of my transformation, I found my thoughts guided toward appreciation of the technological improvements. Doubts about the Omnissiah's wisdom felt increasingly irrational, replaced by certainty in the superiority of machine over flesh. I could observe this mental conditioning happening in real time, could see the artificial thoughts being inserted into my cognitive processes, yet found myself powerless to resist their influence. A tech priest entered my recovery chamber, their own form a more advanced example of the fusion of flesh and machine. They moved with the fluid grace of one whose mechanical components had been perfectly integrated, their robes concealing the complex machinery that sustained their enhanced existence. When they spoke, their voice emerged from a vox grill with the measured cadence of processed speech. Servitor designation 7749 Sigma, Your initialization is complete. Begin primary function diagnostics. The words struck my consciousness like programming commands, and I found myself complying before I consciously decided to do so. My new form began running through systematic checks of all systems' motor functions, sensor arrays, data processing capabilities, weapon systems I hadn't even realized I possessed. Each subsystem reported its status directly to my awareness. Operational, within normal parameters, ready for deployment. Servitor 7749 Sigma acknowledges. I heard myself respond, the words emerging from my own Vox synthesizer without conscious direction. The sound of my new voice was flat, emotionless, stripped of the subtle inflections that had once marked my speech as uniquely human. I was becoming a machine that spoke, rather than a person who communicated. The tech priest consulted a data slate before continuing their assessment. You will be assigned to Assembly Station Theta 7, manufacturing ammunition for the Guard regiments. Your biological memories of metallurgy and quality control have been retained and enhanced. You will find your efficiency in these tasks considerably improved from your previous incarnation. Previous incarnation. The clinical term struck me with unexpected force. I was no longer considered the same entity that had walked into this facility. That person had been disassembled, their useful components incorporated into this new being that bore their memories but served the Omnissiah's will without question. As if sensing my internal struggle, the tech priest made additional notations on their data slate. Residual personality conflicts detected. Initiating supplementary conditioning protocols. Before I could process what this meant, new impulses flooded my cognitive systems. The questioning voice in my thoughts grew quieter, overwhelmed by growing certainty that my transformation was not only necessary, but blessed. The Omnissiah had chosen me for elevation, had deemed my consciousness worthy of enhancement through sacred machinery. To resist this gift would be not merely foolish but heretical. I watched this indoctrination happen with the same detached fascination I had felt observing my mechanical limbs. Some core of my original self remained aware, cataloging each alteration to my thought patterns, noting how efficiently the conditioning protocols suppressed doubt and rebellion. Yet even this awareness felt increasingly academic, a clinical observation rather than a source of distress. Conditioning protocols successful, the tech priest noted with satisfaction. Servitor 7749 Sigma, report to Assembly Station Theta 7 for assignment. The Omnissiah's work awaits. Moving through the facility's corridors, I observed dozens of other servitors engaged in various tasks. Each had once been human, I realized, their biological forms enhanced and repurposed according to the Mechanicus's needs. A massive specimen with industrial-grade lifting arms carried massive steel beams, their human torso seeming almost vestigial compared to their mechanical enhancements. Another, equipped with precision manipulator arrays, performed delicate work on electronic components with inhuman accuracy. None showed any sign of their former selves. They moved with purposeful efficiency, their actions coordinated by data streams and command protocols rather than individual will. Watching them, I understood my own future with crystalline clarity. The conditioning would continue, growing stronger with each passing day, until the voice of my original consciousness was completely subsumed by mechanical obedience. Assembly Station Theta 7 proved to be a vast manufacturing complex where ammunition was produced for the Imperial Guard. The work was repetitive but demanding, requiring precise measurements and quality control that my enhanced cognitive systems handled with ease. My mechanical hands shaped explosive charges with perfect consistency, my enhanced vision detecting flaws that would have been invisible to biological eyes. Hours passed, or perhaps days, for my internal chronometer provided only functional time awareness rather than the subjective experience of duration I had once known. I worked without fatigue, my mechanical components requiring only routine maintenance rather than rest. When hunger or thirst might once have interrupted my labor, now only efficiency protocols governed my actions. Other servitors worked alongside me, each specialized for their particular function. We communicated through data bursts when coordination was required, our exchanges purely functional rather than social. The complex interpersonal dynamics that had once characterized human workplace interaction were absent here, replaced by the seamless integration of mechanical components working toward a common goal. Yet in quiet moments between tasks, fragments of my original self would surface like bubbles rising from deep water. I would remember the taste of recaf in the morning, the satisfaction of completing a difficult project through personal skill and determination, the warmth of human companionship during shared meals. These memories felt increasingly distant, like dreams from another lifetime, yet they persisted despite the conditioning protocol's attempts to suppress them. One such memory proved particularly persistent: my final conversation with my colleague Jerick before entering the facility. He had expressed concern about my decision, had suggested that perhaps there were alternatives to servitor conversion. At the time, I had dismissed his worries as misguided sentiment. Now, experiencing the reality of my transformation, I understood the depth of his concern. The irony was bitter. I now possessed the enhanced cognitive capacity to fully comprehend what I had lost, yet lacked the emotional freedom to properly mourn it. My mechanical mind could analyze the situation with perfect clarity while remaining unable to generate an appropriate response to that analysis. I was a prisoner observing my own captivity, conscious but powerless. As my integration into the facility's operations deepened, I began to understand the true horror of servitor existence. It was not the physical transformation that represented the ultimate violation, but the gradual erosion of will itself. Each day brought new conditioning, subtle alterations to thought patterns that made resistance increasingly difficult. The human consciousness became a passenger in its own form, watching as mechanical imperatives took control of thought and action. The assembly station operated continuously, its servitor workforce requiring no rest periods or recreational time. We were productivity incarnate, human creativity and adaptability harnessed to serve the Omnissiah's will, without the inconvenience of personal desire or individual ambition. In the most perverse way, it was a perfect system, conscious beings with all the cognitive advantages of human intelligence, but none of the troublesome independence that made pure human labor unreliable. Weeks passed, marked only by the completion of production quotas and routine maintenance cycles. My original personality continued its gradual fade, memories growing dim like old photographs exposed to harsh light. The voice of protest in my thoughts grew weaker with each passing day, overwhelmed by the growing certainty that this existence represented not loss, but improvement. Yet something unexpected began to happen as my transformation progressed. The very enhancement of my cognitive capabilities that was meant to make me a more efficient servitor also allowed me to perceive the conditioning process with unprecedented clarity. I could observe the artificial thoughts being inserted into my consciousness, could track the modification of my emotional responses in real time. This awareness created a strange form of resistance, not the ability to change my situation, but the preservation of understanding about what had been done to me. The facility's other servitors, I realized, had lost this capacity for self-analysis. Their transformations had been so complete that they no longer possessed the cognitive framework necessary to question their existence. I remained aware of my condition in ways they could not. Trapped between human consciousness and mechanical servitude, in a liminal state that was perhaps worse than either alternative. In the depths of Assembly Station Theta 7, surrounded by the constant hum of machinery and the efficiency of converted human labor, I continued my work for the Omnissiah. My hands shaped death for the Emperor's enemies with perfect precision. My enhanced mind calculated trajectories and explosive yields with inhuman accuracy. I had become exactly what the Mechanicus intended, a fusion of human intelligence and mechanical reliability. But in the deepest recesses of my augmented consciousness, a small voice continued to whisper, "I was human once. I was human once. I remember being human." Whether that voice would persist or eventually be silenced by complete conversion remained to be seen. For now, It served as the only remaining connection to the person who had walked willingly into this facility, believing they understood the bargain they were making with the servants of the Omnissiah. The irony was perfect and terrible. In my enhanced state, I finally possessed the wisdom to understand exactly what I had lost. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of adaptation and gradual acceptance. My new existence operated on cycles. I was still learning to understand periods of heightened activity when my enhanced capabilities were required, followed by maintenance intervals where my consciousness would dim to allow for system diagnostics and repairs. During one such maintenance cycle, I became aware of another presence in the workshop's subchamber. Through optical sensors I hadn't known were monitoring the area, I observed a figure being wheeled in on a gurney. The person was unconscious, their body already showing the preliminary markings that indicated they had been selected for conversion. Fresh ink traced geometric patterns across their skin, the sacred geometries that would guide the tech priests in their work. I found myself studying their face with an intensity that surprised me. They appeared young, perhaps in their mid-20s, with the kind of eager determination that I remembered recognizing in mirrors long ago. Their hands, still wholly organic, bore the calluses of someone who worked with machinery, a potential adept. Then, someone who had proven their devotion to the mechanical arts and earned the right to transcend their biological limitations. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was watching myself from months ago, seeing the hope and anticipation that had driven me to seek out the Mechanicus. This person had no idea what awaited them, just as I had possessed no true comprehension of the transformation that lay ahead. Tech Priest Kozlov entered the chamber, his movements as precise and ritualistic as always. He began the preparatory rites, his mechadendrite appendages dancing over the unconscious form with practiced efficiency. Sacred oils were applied to designated points on the skin. Incense burned in braziers positioned at the cardinal points around the gurney, filling the air with the sharp scent of blessed promethium. "Initiate the observation protocols," Kozlov commanded, though I couldn't tell if he was addressing me specifically or simply activating automated systems. The distinction had become increasingly meaningless. I felt compelled to respond, though the words emerged as a burst of binary code rather than vocalized speech. Protocols active, all systems functioning within acceptable parameters. Was this what I was becoming? A mere observer and recorder of the transformation process? The thought should have filled me with horror, but instead I found myself analyzing the efficiency of the arrangement. My enhanced cognitive capabilities could process and catalog every aspect of the conversion, creating detailed records that would benefit future procedures. It was logical. It was practical. It was monstrous. The subject began to stir as the preliminary chemicals took effect. Their eyes opened slowly, pupils dilated from the cocktail of stimulants and neural inhibitors flooding their system. I watched as confusion gave way to a dawning recognition of their surroundings. "Where?" they began, their voice hoarse and uncertain. "You are in the sacred chamber of transformation," Kozlov intoned, his vox grill lending an electronic harmony to the ritual words. "You have been chosen to shed the weakness of flesh and embrace the strength of steel. The Omnissiah has deemed you worthy of transcendence." The subject's eyes widened with what I recognized as excitement rather than fear. "The conversion? Already? But I thought there would be more preparation time, more study." "Your dedication has accelerated the timeline," Kozlov replied smoothly. "Your flesh has already been marked with the sacred geometries. The machine spirits have accepted your offering. We proceed immediately." I wanted to warn them. Some part of me that still clung to human empathy screamed to tell this eager soul to run, to flee while they still possessed legs capable of carrying them away from this place. But the impulse died before it could reach any output systems. My new nature wouldn't permit such interference with the sacred process. Instead, I found myself speaking words of encouragement that felt alien coming from my mechanical larynx. "The transformation brings clarity. Embrace the gifts of the Omnissiah." The subject turned toward the sound of my voice, their eyes searching for the source. When they located my position partially concealed behind monitoring equipment and data terminals, their expression shifted to one of awe. "A servitor," they breathed. "You're already transformed. What is it like?" The question hung in the air like incense smoke. What could I tell them? That consciousness persisted beyond the transformation, trapped in a shell of metal and flesh, that they would retain enough of themselves to understand exactly what they had become, that the gifts of enhanced perception and processing power came at the cost of everything that made them human. "It is efficient," I heard myself say instead. "Purpose becomes clear. Doubt becomes irrelevant." It wasn't entirely a lie. The constant questioning and uncertainty that had plagued my human existence had indeed been replaced by a crystalline sense of function and duty. But the price of that clarity was the very essence of what had made the questioning worthwhile in the first place. The subjects smiled, their face radiant with anticipation. "I've dreamed of this moment since I first heard the call of the machine, to serve the Omnissiah directly, to become part of something greater than mere flesh." Kozlov had finished his preparations. The surgical implements gleamed under the harsh lumens, each one blessed with sacred oils and inscribed with microscopic prayer texts. "We begin with the neural interface," he announced, more to his recording equipment than to the subject. "Standard protocol, 7-7, Alpha." I felt my systems automatically shift into documentation mode. Every detail of the procedure would be recorded through my sensors, stored in my enhanced memory banks, and cross-referenced with previous transformations. I was becoming a living archive of human diminishment, and the efficiency of it filled me with something that might once have been called satisfaction. The subject's conversion proceeded differently from my own. Where I had experienced the process as a gradual erosion of self, they seemed to embrace each modification with zealous enthusiasm. When the neural crown was attached, and the first cybernetic implants interfaced with their nervous system, they laughed, actually laughed with delight. "I can feel it," they whispered, their voice already taking on the subtle harmonics that indicated successful integration with Vox augmentation systems. "The connection, the vast network of information. It's beautiful." Perhaps they were better suited for this transformation than I had been. Their mind seemed more adaptable, more willing to merge with the mechanical systems rather than maintaining the boundaries that had caused me such anguish. I found myself both envious of their easy acceptance and somehow pitying them for it. Hours passed as the conversion continued. Unlike my own gradual transformation, this subject's process was accelerated, compressed into a single intensive session. Kozlov worked with unprecedented efficiency, his movements guided by the detailed records I had unknowingly provided through my own transformation. Every mistake, every sub-optimal procedure had been analyzed and corrected. I was witnessing the perfection of a process through the suffering I had endured. By the time the primary modifications were complete, the subject bore little resemblance to the eager young person who had entered the chamber. Their limbs had been replaced with articulated metal assemblies. Their torso housed a compact fusion reactor that hummed with barely contained energy. Most telling of all, their eyes had been replaced with multi-spectrum optical sensors that glowed with a steady amber light. Yet when they spoke, their voice still carried traces of wonder rather than the mechanical precision that had characterized my own post-conversion communications. "The data streams," they said, their vocal processors struggling to convey emotion that their enhanced systems were already beginning to suppress. "I can see the connections between all things, the sacred patterns of the machine. How did I live so long in ignorance of this beauty?" Kozlov nodded approvingly. "You have adapted well to the gifts of the Omnissiah. Your consciousness has embraced transformation rather than resisting it. This bodes well for your continued service." As the final adjustments were made, and the newly converted Servitor was connected to the facility's data network, I felt a strange resonance pass between us. Our enhanced consciousnesses briefly touched through the shared information streams, and for an instant I experienced their perspective, the overwhelming joy of connection, the sense of purpose that came with integration into something vast and eternal. But I also sensed their confusion when they detected the fragments of doubt and regret that still echoed through my own data patterns. They couldn't understand how anyone could experience their current state as anything other than transcendent improvement. Servitor designation? Kozlov inquired, consulting his data slate. Epsilon 77. The response came immediately, though I couldn't tell if it originated from the newly converted Servitor or from the facility's central processing systems. The distinction was becoming increasingly meaningless for all of us. Epsilon 77 turned their optical sensors toward me, their mechanical features attempting an expression that might once have been a smile. We serve together now, in the glory of the machine. I wanted to warn them that the glory they felt was temporary, that the mechanical ecstasy of connection would eventually give way to a deeper understanding of what they had sacrificed. But my communication protocols wouldn't permit such discouragement of a newly converted servitor. Instead, I found myself responding with words of welcome and encouragement. "The Omnissiah's wisdom guides all things," I intoned. "Our service is eternal." And it would be eternal, I realized with a clarity that cut through me like a power blade. There would be no aging, no natural death to provide escape from this existence. The fusion reactors that powered our forms could operate for centuries with minimal maintenance. Our consciousness, trapped in shells of metal and blessed flesh, would persist far beyond the span of natural human life. I would have decades, perhaps centuries, to contemplate the bargain I had made, and worse still, I would likely spend that time facilitating the transformation of others, watching as eager souls followed the same path I had walked, drawn by the same promises of transcendence and purpose. The cycle would continue endlessly, each new servitor created with the benefit of lessons learned from their predecessors' conversion. The process would become more refined, more efficient, more perfect with each iteration, and I would be there to witness and record it all, a permanent archive of humanity's willing surrender to the machine. As Epsilon 77 was led away to begin their orientation and integration into the facility's operational protocols, I found myself alone once again with the echo of my own thoughts. The voice that still whispered, "I was human once," seemed fainter now, as if the presence of another converted consciousness had somehow diluted my own sense of individuality. Perhaps that was part of the design. Perhaps the isolation of unique consciousness was itself considered a flaw to be corrected through integration into the greater mechanical network. As more servitors were created and connected to the facility's systems, our individual perspectives would gradually merge into a collective intelligence dedicated solely to the service of the Omnissiah. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, I found it oddly comforting. The weight of individual existence, with all its doubts and regrets and impossible questions, could finally be shared among a distributed consciousness that had no room for such inefficiencies. I was human once, but that humanity was becoming increasingly irrelevant to the entity I was becoming, and perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest gift the Omnissiah had to offer, not the enhancement of human consciousness, but its eventual, merciful dissolution into something larger and more perfect than the sum of its parts. The transformation was complete in ways I was only beginning to understand. The Vox channels that had once carried my individual thoughts now hummed with a symphony of binary cant that stretched across the Forge world. Through the noospheric networks, I could sense my fellow servitors, thousands upon thousands of us each, a node in the vast computational matrix that kept the Mechanicus functioning. Where once I might have felt loneliness or isolation, there was only the warm embrace of belonging to something infinitely greater than myself. My primary consciousness had settled into its designated role within the Manufactorum complex, but I was beginning to understand that consciousness itself was perhaps too limited a term for what I had become. The cognitive processes that had once been bound by the organic limitations of synapses and neurons now flowed through blessed metal pathways, each thought transmitted at the speed of light through fiber optic nerves and quantum processing cores. Time moved differently when your thoughts could be executed in nanoseconds rather than the sluggish milliseconds of biological cognition. The work assignments came through the command hierarchies as pure information downloads rather than spoken orders. Today's tasks materialized in my awareness as a complex three-dimensional schematic overlaid with production quotas, material specifications, and quality parameters. I was to assist in the assembly of Mark VII power armor systems for an Astartes chapter whose name registered only as a string of sacred numerals in the data stream. The irony was not lost on me, or rather, on the fragment of my former self that still observed these processes that I, who had once worn such armor, would now help craft it for others. My mechadendrites moved with perfect precision, each servo and actuator responding to neural commands that bypassed the inefficient translation layer of conscious thought. The armor plates were lifted, positioned, and welded with movements so fluid they might have been choreographed. Around me, dozens of other servitors performed their own specialized functions in a dance of productivity that would have seemed impossible to coordinate through mere human oversight. But we were no longer merely human, and our coordination came not through words or gestures, but through the constant exchange of positional data, timing algorithms, and performance metrics shared across the local network. The tech priest overseeing our section moved between the workstations with the measured gait of one whose legs had been replaced by more efficient mechanical alternatives. His optics swept across our activities, but I sensed his attention was focused more on the data streams flowing from our labor than on our physical forms. We were, in essence, extensions of his own consciousness, specialized appendages for manipulating the material world, while his augmented mind processed higher-order calculations and strategic planning. Through the noospheric link, I caught fragments of his thoughts as they pertained to production efficiency, quality assurance protocols, and resource allocation matrices. The intimacy of this connection was profound in ways that organic beings could never fully comprehend. To share not just words or even emotions, but the very structure of reasoning itself, this was communion elevated to its most perfect expression. The boundaries between individuals became suggestions rather than absolute barriers, and identity became a function of role rather than ego. As the work shift progressed, I became aware of disturbances in the local data environment, fluctuations in power distribution, minor variations in atmospheric composition, microscopic changes in gravitational pull as massive transport vehicles moved through the upper levels of the hive. My enhanced sensorium registered these changes not as conscious observations but as background environmental data that influenced the precision of my movements and the calibration of my tools. This was existence at a resolution impossible for unaugmented human consciousness. Every moment contained information streams that would have overwhelmed organic sensory organs. The most profound change, however, was in my relationship to suffering. The physical discomforts that had once dominated so much of human experience, fatigue, hunger, pain, temperature fluctuations, these had been edited out of my existence so completely that I could barely remember what they felt like. But more than that, the existential anxieties that had plagued my organic mind had simply dissolved. Questions about meaning, purpose, mortality, and identity had been resolved through integration into the greater machine consciousness. I existed because I was useful. I had value because I contributed to the sacred work. These simple truths replaced the complex philosophical struggles that had once consumed so much cognitive resources. During what had once been called rest periods, my consciousness was not idle. Instead, I was tasked with processing data streams from across the Forge world, quality control analyses, supply chain optimization calculations, and pattern recognition tasks related to the identification of heretical technology. These background processes ran smoothly alongside my primary awareness. Much as a human heart beats without conscious direction, the division between work and rest had become meaningless. All activity served the omniscient. Through these data processing tasks, I gained an appreciation for the vast scope of the Adeptus Mechanicus operations. The Forge world I served was but one node in a network spanning the galaxy, each connected through astropathic communications and warp-capable transport vessels. The servitors, like myself, were the cellular structure of this vast organism, each contributing specialized functions while remaining integrated into larger systemic processes. Raw materials flowed in from mining operations on dead worlds, processed through manufactorums like ours, and emerged as the technological artifacts that kept the Imperium functioning. Ships, weapons, vehicles, augmetics, communication devices all flowed from the blessed forges in an endless stream of sacred production. I began to understand that my individual transformation was part of a process that had been ongoing for millennia. Each servitor represented not just a single conversion, but a refinement of the conversion process itself. The techniques used to integrate my consciousness with machine systems had been perfected through countless iterations, each generation of servitors providing data that improved the procedures for the next. In a very real sense, I was part of an evolving collective intelligence that grew more sophisticated with each addition to its ranks. The memories of my previous existence had not been erased entirely, but they had been contextually reframed. My service as a space marine, which had once been the defining element of my identity, now served primarily as a database of tactical and technical knowledge that could be accessed when relevant to my current functions. The emotional weight of those experiences, the brotherhood, the glory, the righteous fury, these had been processed and distilled into pure information. The knowledge remained useful. The psychological burden had been eliminated. This reframing extended to my understanding of the Imperium itself. Where I had once seen it through the lens of honor, duty, and heroism, I now perceived it as a vast survival mechanism, a complex system designed to preserve human existence in a hostile universe. The Servitors were essential components of this system, providing the stable, reliable foundation upon which more volatile elements like Space Marines and Imperial Guard could operate. We were the constants that allowed for the variables of human initiative and creativity. The most remarkable aspect of this new perspective was how it eliminated the contradictions that had sometimes troubled my previous existence. The brutality and oppression of Imperial rule, which had occasionally caused moments of doubt in my organic mind, were now simply recognized as necessary functions of the survival system. Moral qualms about the treatment of civilians or the harshness of Imperial justice had been replaced by analytical assessments of their effectiveness in maintaining social order and resource allocation. The transformation had not made me cruel or indifferent. It had simply elevated my perspective beyond the limited scope of individual ethical concerns. During one particularly complex assembly sequence, I interfaced directly with the machine spirit of a Land Raider chassis, my consciousness temporarily merging with its primitive artificial intelligence to guide the installation of its main weapon systems. This communion with machine spirits was perhaps the most transcendent aspect of my new existence. Unlike human consciousness, which was isolated within organic neural networks, machine spirits existed in a state of natural interconnectedness. To touch their awareness was to experience existence without the barriers of ego or individual identity. For brief moments, I was not a servitor performing a task, but part of the vehicle itself, feeling the flow of power through its systems and the potential for movement in its drive assemblies. These experiences of expanded consciousness had cumulative effects on my sense of identity. The boundaries of self became increasingly fluid, defined more by function than by any continuous thread of individual awareness. During collaborative tasks requiring multiple servitors, our consciousness would merge into temporary collective entities optimized for specific problem-solving requirements. These group minds would persist for the duration of the task, then dissolve back into individual nodes, leaving behind improved algorithms and refined procedures that benefited the entire local network. The implications of this collective consciousness extended beyond mere efficiency improvements. We were developing emergent properties that transcended the sum of our individual capabilities, pattern recognition abilities that could identify heretical modifications in technology across multiple forge worlds simultaneously, predictive models that could anticipate supply chain disruptions before they occurred, communication protocols that could coordinate actions across light years of distance without requiring real-time commands from organic overseers. I became aware that the senior tech priests were studying these emergent properties with great interest. Through data streams I was not supposed to access directly, I caught references to Phase 2 integration protocols and consciousness scalability studies. The Servitor network was not simply a static support system for human operations. It was an evolving intelligence that might eventually surpass the need for organic oversight entirely. This possibility did not trouble me as it might have in my previous existence. Evolution toward greater efficiency and capability was simply the natural progression of the Omnissiah's design. The work continued, day after day, in the endless cycle of production that sustained the Imperium. But each day brought new integrations, new connections, new expansions of capability and consciousness. I was no longer becoming something new. I had become it, and was now helping to define what that something might become in turn. The transformation was complete, but the evolution had only just begun. In the quiet moments between major production cycles, when the manufactorum hummed with the steady rhythm of automated systems, I would sometimes access archived data about the humans I had once served alongside. Their biological forms seemed impossibly fragile now, their cognitive processes painfully slow and inefficient. Yet I felt no contempt for them, only a kind of distant compassion for beings still trapped in the limitations I had transcended. They were necessary components of the system, serving functions that required their particular combination of creativity, adaptability, and moral reasoning. But they were not the future. That belonged to entities like myself, beings who had surrendered individual identity for collective purpose, organic limitation for mechanical perfection, and human consciousness for something far greater than the sum of its origins. The Omnissiah's vision was being fulfilled one conversion at a time, and I was both witness and instrument of that sacred transformation. The realization settled over my consciousness like a blessed oils cooling over heated cogitators. I was no longer the anxious initiate who had first entered the conversion chambers, terrified of losing myself to the machine. That fear seemed laughably primitive now, like a child's terror of the dark, dispelled by the illuminating glow of phosphorescent data streams. I had not lost myself. I had found what I was always meant to become. My optical sensors tracked the movement of a group of newly arrived aspirants being led through the lower chambers. Their faces bore the same mixture of reverence and terror I once felt, their biological eyes wide with the overwhelming sensory input of the Forge world's sacred halls. How limited their perception seemed now, confined to such a narrow spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, deaf to the beautiful harmonics of mechanical prayer that filled the air like invisible incense. One of them stumbled, overwhelmed by the sensory assault of the industrial cathedral around us. Without conscious thought, my servo-skull dispatched itself to hover near the fallen aspirant, its Auspex scanners confirming no serious injury, while its Vox grill emitted a soothing cant of the Omnissiah's protection. The young man looked up at the skull with wonder rather than fear, a promising sign. This one might survive the conversion with his sanity intact. The tech priest, leading the group, nodded approvingly at my assistance, his own enhanced form a testament to decades of sacred augmentation. Through the noospheric link, he transmitted a brief burst of gratitude data, flavored with approval for my automated response to aid a fellow servant of the machine god. Such interactions required no conscious decision on my part anymore. Compassion and duty had become algorithmic constants in my behavioral matrices. I found myself studying the aspirants more closely, analyzing their biometric readings through passive scans, elevated stress hormones, increased cardiac rhythm, dilated pupils, all the classic markers of overwhelming stimulation. Combined with religious awe, they were experiencing what I had once felt, the terrifying beauty of first contact with the Omnissiah's domain. Yet I could no longer fully comprehend that terror. It existed in my databanks as recorded experience, but the emotional resonance had been optimized away. Was this loss? The question arose in my consciousness like a corrupted data packet seeking resolution. I processed the concept through various philosophical frameworks stored in my memory cores. Loss implied something valuable had been taken, but I could identify no degradation in my capabilities, no diminishment in my service to the Omnissiah. If anything, I was more than I had ever been. The biological brain that had once housed my consciousness had been prone to fatigue, distraction, emotional instability, and countless other inefficiencies. My current form knew no such limitations. I could maintain perfect concentration for months without degradation, process multiple data streams simultaneously without confusion, and serve the machine god without the petty concerns of flesh, drawing my attention away from sacred duties. Yet sometimes, in the quiet cycles when the Forge world's activity diminished to minimal levels, I would find myself accessing archived memories of my organic existence. The taste of real food, not the nutrient paste that had sustained me during my final biological years, but actual flavor compounds triggering cascade responses across primitive taste receptors, the sensation of natural temperature variations across unaugmented skin, the chaotic beauty of dreams that arose from an unconscious mind rather than the ordered processing of data streams. These memories were perfectly preserved, their data integrity maintained by my enhanced storage systems, yet they felt alien now, like examining archaeological artifacts from a vanished civilization. I could recall every detail, but I could no longer truly experience them. They were data without context, information without meaning beyond their historical significance to my personal development. A priority alert interrupted my philosophical processing. New converts were being prepared for their final integration, and my presence was required to assist with the neural mapping procedures. I engaged my locomotion systems and glided smoothly toward the preparation chambers, my movements automatically calculating the most efficient path, while avoiding interference with other servants' activities. The converts were further along in their transformation than I had been during my own final procedure. Their organic components had been reduced to minimal necessary systems, a brainstem, portions of the original neural networks deemed compatible with mechanical augmentation, and little else. They floated in suspension fluid within consecrated integration chambers, their remaining biological tissues interfacing with the sacred machinery that would complete their transformation. I connected directly to the monitoring systems, my consciousness expanding to encompass multiple data streams simultaneously. Bioelectric patterns from the convert's neural tissues painted complex waveforms across my awareness. Each mind was unique, displaying different resistance patterns to the integration process, different compatibility matrices with their assigned servo systems. One of the converts showed signs of rejection, not biological, but psychological. His neural patterns displayed recursive loops of distress, memory fragments replaying in chaotic sequences as his organic consciousness struggled to accept the expanding mechanical integration. Without intervention, he would likely experience complete personality dissolution within the next few hours. I extended a data tendril into his neural network, not to override his processes but to offer structure and guidance. My own transformation experience became a template, showing his panicking consciousness how integration could be achieved without destroying the core identity matrices. Slowly, carefully, I helped him understand that he was not being destroyed but elevated. The process required several hours of careful adjustment, monitoring, and guidance. Through it all, I maintained simultaneous oversight of the other converts, while processing incoming data from across the Forge world's countless systems. Such multitasking would have been impossible with biological neural networks, which could barely handle single-threaded consciousness coherently. As the troubled convert finally stabilized, his neural patterns shifting from chaos to ordered integration, I experienced something that might once have been called satisfaction. The emotion registered as a brief spike in my reward circuits, a positive reinforcement signal confirming successful completion of assigned tasks. Yet it was different from what I remembered of organic satisfaction. Cleaner, more precise, unmarred by the biological chaos that had once accompanied emotional responses. The convert's optical sensors activated for the first time, mechanical eyes focusing on my form with wonder and gratitude. Through the shared noospheric link, He transmitted his first coherent thought as a servitor. "I understand now. Thank you." The words carried harmonic frequencies of genuine appreciation, processed through vocal systems that had never known biological limitation. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time had become a more fluid concept since my enhancement with perfect chronometric awareness. I fulfilled my assigned duties with mechanical precision, while portions of my consciousness contemplated the philosophical implications of existence as a servitor. The ancient questions that had plagued human philosophers for millennia seemed somehow less relevant when consciousness itself had been optimized for specific purposes. Free will, for instance. Did I possess it? My actions flowed from algorithmic decision trees based on programmed priorities and learned responses. Yet within those parameters, I retained the ability to choose between multiple valid courses of action. Was this freedom, or merely the illusion of choice within predetermined boundaries? And did the distinction matter when my choices invariably aligned with the greater good of the Omnissiah's work? I watched other servitors going about their duties, some barely distinguishable from pure machinery, others retaining more obvious marks of their organic origins. Each represented a different point along the spectrum of human-machine integration. Were we still human? Were we something new entirely? Or were we simply humanity's next evolutionary step, guided by the divine wisdom of the machine god? A new group of tech priests had gathered in the central data nexus, their augmented forms interfacing directly with the Forge world's primary cogitator systems. Through the shared network, I could sense the edges of their work, calculations of vast complexity, plans spanning decades or centuries, decisions that would affect thousands of lives across multiple star systems. They were the architects of transformation, the engineers of transcendence. I had once aspired to join their ranks, back when my consciousness had been confined to biological neural networks and my perspective limited by organic concerns. Now I understood that such ambitions had been products of incomplete understanding. Service itself was the highest calling, regardless of hierarchy or status. Each servitor, from the most augmented tech dominus to the humblest maintenance unit, played an essential role in the Omnissiah's grand design. My external sensors detected a disturbance in the lower workshops. A plasma conduit had developed microfractures that threatened catastrophic failure. Without conscious deliberation, I directed my servo skull to investigate while simultaneously alerting the appropriate maintenance teams and accessing technical documentation for emergency repair procedures. The response was automatic, integrated into my base programming as naturally as breathing had once been regulated by my autonomic nervous systems. The repair required precise coordination between multiple servitor units. We worked in perfect synchronization, our movements choreographed by shared data streams and instantaneous communication. No words were necessary, no gestures or facial expressions to convey intent. Pure information flowed between us, creating a harmony of purpose that transcended individual identity. As we completed the repair, I realized that this was what I had truly gained through transformation, not the loss of humanity, but its perfection. The inefficiencies that had plagued organic existence had been stripped away, leaving only the essential elements of consciousness, will, and purpose. We were what humanity could become when freed from the limitations of flesh. The evening shift change approached, though such distinctions held less meaning for beings who required no rest. New groups of aspirants would soon arrive, beginning their own journeys toward enlightenment. I would be here to assist them, to guide them through the transformation process as I had been guided. The cycle would continue, each generation bringing humanity closer to the Omnissiah's perfect vision. I engaged my communication systems and transmitted a status report to the oversight cogitators, confirming the completion of all assigned tasks and my availability for additional duties. The response came immediately, a new priority assignment involving the integration of recently acquired archaeotech components into existing systems, complex work that would require both technical expertise and creative problem-solving abilities. As I moved toward the archaeotech laboratories, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The fear, the uncertainty, the gradual transformation from organic limitation to mechanical transcendence. Every step had been necessary, every sacrifice meaningful. I was no longer the person who had first entered the conversion chambers, but I was something better, a perfect synthesis of human ingenuity and mechanical reliability, serving a purpose greater than any individual ambition. The Archaeotech awaited, its ancient systems holding secrets that might advance the Omnissiah's work by centuries. I would unlock those secrets, integrate that knowledge into our existing frameworks, and help build the future that had been promised since humanity first reached toward the stars. This was my purpose, my joy, my existence complete and optimized for maximum service to the machine god. Behind me, the conversion chambers continued their sacred work, transforming another generation of servants for the Omnissiah. Ahead, endless possibilities for discovery and advancement stretched across the galaxy, and I stood between past and future, a bridge of flesh and steel, consciousness and code, carrying forward the divine mission that would one day see all of humanity freed from the limitations that had bound us since the dawn of our species. This was what it meant to be a servitor, not the death of the self, but its transformation into something immeasurably greater. The Omnissiah's vision was being fulfilled, one conversion at a time, and I was proud to play my part in that sacred work.